Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel. My name is Bird's Eye View Politics, and in this video we're going to be taking a bird's eye view look at South Korea's brief stint of martial law after it was declared by President Yoon. Now, this video is being uploaded just 1 minute after President Yoon declared that he would end martial law, which wasn't actually known until this declaration. Originally, it had been thought that he was trying to essentially do a self-coup of sorts. So I'm going to more focus this video, instead of what I was expecting, which would be on the current martial law situation, but rather on the martial law lead up to it, and also now what I expect to happen in the aftermath. So first, we're going to have to go back a few years. We're going to have to start back in the 2022 South Korean presidential elections, because this is really where it all started. Yoon Suk-yeol, the now president of South Korea at the time, was a candidate of People Power, which was the right-wing party in South Korea. Pretty much all sides except the Democratic Party, the center-left party in South Korea, to win the election. They all accepted that they would win. It was never really thought that People Power would actually stand a chance of winning. However, Yoon Suk-yeol successfully combined right-wing populism with some alliances with more centrist leaders to actually win a narrow victory of just 48, nearing 49% of the vote over Lee Jae-myung, who was the candidate of the Democratic Party. Now, almost immediately, President Yoon was immediately thrust into a tough situation because his party did not control the legislature. Rather, the Democratic Party had a strong majority. And in their parliament system, it is very, very hard for you to essentially remove the previous legislature. Normally, you can call snap elections, such as in France, the president could unilaterally do so. In South Korea, the constitution bars you from dissolving parliament, which would lead to you calling a new one. So from 2020 on until 2024, People Power was actually out of power in the legislature in 2020. The Democratic Party had a majority with 180 seats. United Future, which is what People Power eventually became, had just 103 seats, with an assortment of smaller parties winning the remainder. In 2024, many people saw this almost midterm as a referendum on the South Korean president. In South Korea, you were only allowed to serve one 5-year term, which meant that Yoon would only have one chance to achieve his desired parliamentary majority and pass many of the laws that he believed should be done. Up until this point, President Yoon was really stuck on foreign policy. He could only actually affect change there because domestic policy was generally controlled by both the president and the parliament together, whereas the president alone had control over foreign policy. And this meant that South Korea, under President Yoon, was unable to take a more conservative direction on many domestic priorities which he wanted. Now this fast forwards to 2024, where the Democratic Party once again won a massive majority. The right wing won a tiny sliver of a gain, just 3.62 percentage points higher, gaining just 5 seats, while the left-wing Democratic Party, center-left, lost 7 seats, and then a new third party won 12 seats, with once again other smaller parties winning just 4 seats. This was really bad for Yoon, because Yoon, by this point, had been getting very angry with the Assembly, and the Assembly was getting very angry with him. The Assembly was blocking many of his priorities. They were still trying to essentially obstruct the president, as any opposition party does. And the governing party was none too happy. In fact, Han Dong-hoon, who was the leader and still is the leader of the People Power Party in South Korea, he was actually backing Yoon, but at this point he began to take certain steps against him, and so did many members of People Power. This is because in South Korea, once again, you only get one 5-year term as president, and once that's over, there's no coming back. You're kind of out of politics, or you can back your party from the sidelines, or maybe lead them in parliament, but you're not coming back as president, which is the highest power that you can be in South Korea. And the People Power Party started to fracture. There were many dissenting factions, and this has continued up to the present day, where many speculated that President Yoon actually would lose his control over the party as a whole. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party under Lee Jae-myung has actually gained significant steam, and if we look at the opinion polls, I mean, the DPK has made major gains over the PPP, which is the People Power Party, and this has once again led to President Yoon being even more skeptical of the coming legislative elections in 2028, when he could potentially try and lead the party in some form. Once again, in South Korea, there are major differences from traditional systems in the United States, whereas in the United States, the leader of a party is generally thought to be that of the president. In this case, for example, Donald Trump leads the Republican Party, whereas Joe Biden would have been considered to be the leader of the Democratic Party, then Kamala Harris, and so on. In South Korea, this isn't the case. The actual leaders of the party are typically found in parliament, and in this case, that's Han Dong-hoon, whereas the president is also aligned with said party and effectively a co-leader, as they do not have significant power in the legislature. President Yoon also suffered from very low disapproval ratings. In fact, he had over 70% disapproval according to most recent polls. And if we look at the presidential polling, it was very clear that his deep rival Lee Jae-myung was actually on a surefire victory course, polling at over 40% in many recent polls, whereas his protege Han Dong-hoon over here, who he was supposedly allied with, was now going down towards the low teens. This all culminated in Yoon trying to pass a budget in the past few days where he had proposed significant expense increases in many parts of the government, and the Democratic Party was none too happy. They believed that the People Power Party was very corrupt, and the People Power Party, including Yoon Suk-yeol's wife, had actually been caught potentially with many scandals. There have been a lot of scandal accusations being thrown around, and the Democratic Party tried to slash a huge part of the budget, to which Yoon Suk-yeol decided that this was effectively sabotaging the government and sabotaging the state. Now, if we look at why Yoon Suk-yeol decided that he could declare martial law, it's a lot more confusing, and the results will be out in the next few weeks, months, and probably years. However, from what we know so far, it seems that Yoon Suk-yeol believed that he was going to lose power as president due to significant threats of impeachment against many of his key ministers, and either this would come around in 2027 when he was succeeded by his fierce opponent Lee Jae-myung, or this would come about potentially even earlier if the Democratic Party decided to impeach him itself, and this likely appears to be the case following this attempted martial law declaration, which has clearly backfired after he is now calling for it to cease, and he is going to end martial law. This once again, just coming 9 minutes ago now from the New York Times. Now, Yoon Suk-yeol also made one major miscalculation, which is that he apparently thought that his party would unite around his declaration of martial law, similar as South Korea had in the past. South Korea has experimented quite a bit with martial law and with right-wing governments elected by the people turning into right-wing dictatorships. And this has definitely been the case at least before the 1980s, which is from where South Korea became the democratic stronghold that it is today, where it is commonly understood as this kind of Western, but of course South Korean, democracy where people are free to run, free to express themselves. And Yoon Suk-yeol's martial law declaration kind of took a lot of that away. Part of the martial law declaration would have outlawed parliament and all parliamentary activities. It put the media very closely under government control. There would have been a significant amount of pro-Yoon sources that would have been bolstered, and a significant amount of pro-Lee Jae-myung, or rather anti-Yoon, newspapers that would have been shut down under the martial law declaration had it been continued. Now, Yoon Suk-yeol really had two choices after he declared this martial law, because almost immediately there were massive protests. For the one part, he did declare this extremely late at night. There was no reason for him to declare it late at night other than to try and avoid the protests. And once he did this, the battle was kind of lost from there, because a lot of his legitimacy in any martial law declaration would have been being very, in other words, upfront. Now, it's hard to tell if South Korea would ever have allowed him to declare martial law, and I tend to think that it never would have, but declaring it in the middle of the night surely did not help any legitimacy that his martial law declaration was granted. Now, Yoon Suk-yeol almost immediately turned around and was struggling right from the very beginning. In fact, his supposed protege, Han Dong-hoon, had actually immediately come out and said that this was something he did not support, and that he would work with the Democratic Party, even though that's his own party's fierce rival, to revert this declaration of martial law. And this caused them to immediately try and go to the Parliament building, where Yoon had actually stationed significant amount of troops and other forces from the martial law declaration around the Parliament to try and block the parliamentarians from getting in. However, 190 of the 300 members of the National Assembly, including many from the Democratic Party and also some from the People Power Party and other smaller parties, they were actually able to make it into the parliament either by jumping over fences, climbing through various areas, evading the security forces writ large. And from this, all 190 were able to vote unanimously to suspend this martial law declaration. And this effectively ended any chance that President Yoon had of maintaining this declaration further than the next few days. And this is because firmly President Yoon just had no chance to fight back, because once that law was declared, martial law was declared by the president, the legislature had full authority under the South Korean constitution to roll back this martial law declaration. They could vote to suspend it, and then the president would have to, or should have to, accept it. Now, of course, the president doesn't have to, but according to the South Korean constitution, they would. And the military in South Korea has proven to generally be reasonably loyal to the constitution. They carried out the martial law declaration only until the martial law declaration was revoked essentially by the National Assembly, and from there they immediately left Parliament. Now, President Yoon's attempt clearly has seemed to fail if he is calling for martial law to now end. Let's check the new update. He's waiting for members of his cabinet to arrive so that he could lift martial law, which has been in place just for 5 hours. And remember, at the time of recording, it is 2:50 p.m. Where I am on the East Coast, but it is actually around 3, 4, 5 in the morning for South Korea. He actually declared this at midnight. And so South Korea really has had a lot going on with martial law, and it's unclear where the aftermath is going to go. But that's where I'm going to try and take those of you who are viewing this video. Now, fundamentally, the South Korean population is probably very anti Yoon. He has 70% disapproval, and the first thing that will come after the end of martial law will be a discussion of should Mr. Yoon, President Yoon, be impeached. And I would say that he probably will be. I would find it very unlikely for him to not be impeached after a previous president, also of People Power, had to be impeached as well by many South Koreans after she had done a lot of very shady stuff in the background. Now, at the time, the party was called Saenuri, it's Park Geun-hye, and she was elected against Moon Jae-in in 2012. However, in 2017, she was actually impeached and removed from office, which led to the center-left dominance of the country in the 2017 elections, before, of course, now they won power back, the right won power back in 2022. Now they are going to be impeached, likely, yet again, which would cause removal of office and an immediate snap election. And this will probably lead to Lee Jae-myung winning the new election because, well, one, he's already polling miles ahead of his nearest competition, but two, Lee Jae-myung is simply the most obvious option. The DPK is not going to want to hold a fierce primary campaign after the country nearly went to martial law, and the PPP is going to seriously struggle to do anything after this attempt for martial law. And even in the last election following the impeachment, the right was generally only able to win 24%, barely finishing ahead of a third party. And I would expect a similar result this time around, with the Democrats clearly winning maybe 40, even up to 50%, with the Conservative Party of South Korea, People Power, really struggling to do anything to put up any strong resistance to Lee Jae-myung. So that's where I think this goes from a political lens. But how about the broader South Korean landscape? Well, I do think the South Korean political landscape is going to change in a significant way. We saw in the last parliamentary elections, which are the most recent in 2024, earlier this year in April, that the Democratic Alliance was actually able to win 52% of the vote in constituencies, which was enough to win a significant majority. However, a third party called Rebuilding Korea, led by Cho Kuk, a former member of the Democratic Party, had actually won 24% of the regional vote. The Democratic Party only won 26%, as their voters heavily overlapped. If you look here, 51% of the constituency vote, but they only won 26%, 24% over here. You can clearly see a lot of correlation right there between the regional vote shares for the Democratic Party and Rebuilding Korea versus the constituency vote for the Democratic Party as a whole. So I would expect a significant battle in the legislative elections in 2028, and I do think that this will probably permanently alter South Korea's political landscape, because if we look back to the last time when there was martial law, if we go far enough back to the 1980s when they first became a democracy, we go from 1980 with Chun Do-wan at 1981, once again, where he won in the presidential elections, to the first real free elections in 1987. There was a sea change in South Korean politics. Suddenly, you had three parties, really four parties, who could actually win heavy support throughout the country. It was heavily regionalized, and that really has continued to be the trend. This is one of South Korea's main problems writ large, has been the heavily regionalization of the country. The Southeast tends to support more conservative candidates. The Southwest is very strongly aligned with the center-left candidates, and everywhere else is kind of in its own area, where the North tends to be the battleground, particularly the capital city of Seoul, and that tends to determine who wins in any given election. If we look at 1997, once again, the Southwest tends to back the left, the Southeast tends to back the right, and the North kind of splits, usually between the West and East, in a very close election. And ultimately, that is where South Korea will probably be heading in the future. Now, the real question is, will South Koreans try to remedy this current Southeast-Southwest polarization that has been persisting for decades? And if there is any way to remedy this, because ultimately, the longer that this goes on, the longer that there was more risk of infighting and significant polarization in the country. After all, if all of your neighbors vote for one party, you probably will too. That's just straight how political geography works in the modern era. If your neighbors are voting for someone, you probably are too. And if all of your neighbors are voting for someone in the whole region, then that tends to lead to significant polarization, because you never meet people of the other side. And ultimately, that's probably where Yoon overplayed his hand the most, is that he truly thought that this part of the country, which has typically been held by the right for years, represented much more of the South Korean population than actually seemed. Thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.